Protests in Iran continue as I think we're about on the 10th or going into the second week as thousands flood the streets of Tehran in defiance over the death of a 22-year-old woman. Now, Iran's morality police arrested the woman allegedly for not wearing her headscarf appropriately, and she died in their custody shortly thereafter. Now, dozens of people have been killed by the Iranian regime in the ensuing protest, which, frankly, actually do not show any signs of slowing. Well, yesterday, Iran launched attacks on the Kurdish region of Iraq, blaming them for what was happening in the streets of Tehran. Joining me now to discuss this live from Jerusalem is Chris Mitchell, Middle East Bureau Chief for CBN News. Chris, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Tony, great to be with you again.
So what's the latest that's happening there in Iran?
Well, from my understanding, Tony, the latest is about 88 people officially have been killed during the protests, but that number is likely much higher than that, because what happens sometimes when people go to recover the body of their loved ones, they have to, in order to get the body, they have to actually pledge that they will remain quiet. So a lot of people, as you said, dozens of people have died. Apparently on Saturday, there's a protest planned in daylight in Tehran, so that's one thing to be keeping an eye on. Another thing that's happening inside of the country is some of the businesses are beginning to close down in support of the protest. So it doesn't seem to be slowing down. It has spread throughout the country. And one thing to note too, the internet seems to have been shut down, despite the fact that Elon Musk had said that he would activate Starlink. It's a little problematic because he needs receivers on the ground to spread that internet. So the government is trying to just shut down any social media that's coming out of Iran. But these protests seem to be very widespread and very fervent.
So we've had protests before in Iran. What's the difference about the current protest?
Well, there are some similarities between the protests that were in 2009, the so-called Green Revolution. There have been protests since every year since 2017 in one form or another. Perhaps the difference here is how deeply it is among the people. It's not just about the hijabs. That's certainly the focal point right now, but it goes deeper than that. People really do want regime change. They don't want a moderate regime. They want this regime that's lasted since 1979 to be toppled. One encouraging news is that two U.S. senators, Senator Bob Menendez, Senator Mike Rounds, have called for regime change. And I talked to earlier today to an Iranian person that's now living in the U.S., said that's huge development, that some of the senators would go that far to change or advocate a change in U.S. policy. And also, if we see other nations start to support these protests, that could make a difference. But a lot of people, Tony, are asking the question, is this a tipping point that the regime could change? It's very hard to say what will happen, but the odds, I think, or the favor, the support would be on the regime change. The regime, that is, they have the guns, they have the army, they have the forces. The people have their fervency, their deep-seated distrust and hatred for the regime. But whether or not that's enough, it remains to be seen.
I mean, they're very vulnerable right now, I would think, with the economy, with all that's going on. In fact, I want to play a clip from Senator Ben Sasse from yesterday on the Senate floor. Play clip number 7, please.
Right now, America's policy toward Iran is hopelessly schizophrenic. We cannot stand on the side of Iranian protesters at the same time that we are trying to re-sign a nuclear deal with the same mullahs that would release billions of dollars back into their hands help them shore up their power, and do nothing to prevent putting a catastrophic weapon into their genocidal hands.
Do you see it that way, that the administration, by trying to re-enter this nuclear agreement, is bolstering the hand of a vulnerable regime?
Yeah, I can't. I think he's just hit it right the nail on the head, Tony. He said it very clearly. Giving billions of dollars through a nuclear deal would just fund this genocidal regime to suppress its people, to oppress its people, to spread its brand of Shiite ideology and around this region against Israel, that it says almost daily that it will want to wipe out the Jewish state. It would fund the Houthis in Yemen, Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas. It is schizophrenic to be, on the one hand, standing with the protesters, but also negotiating with the regime that would literally just fund their genocidal ambitions around this region. Hopefully that there'll be some change of mind, and perhaps this deal won't go through. That would just fund the Islamic regime.
So, Chris Mitchell, how is this being viewed in Israel, which obviously has a lot more skin in the game than the U.S. does? Because, Iran, they have Israel in their crosshairs, and they have the means to come after them.
Yeah, well, obviously Israel is supporting the protesters and against the regime, and they're using this perhaps as one other tool in their arsenal to advocate the fact that the U.S. would not enter into a nuclear deal, or any of the nations that would want to join the U.S. In this kind of regime, advocating for this nuclear deal. So Israel certainly is behind these protesters, and certainly behind a regime that would really change, that would just literally change the whole region and the whole Middle East, if not the world. And I would just add, Tony, as you've been encouraging people to be praying for the people of Florida, and rightly so, but also pray for these protesters that are literally putting their lives on the line for freedom, for the change of this oppressive regime. And they certainly need our prayers. And one other thing that's happening in Iran, and has been happening for years, is that many of these Muslims are coming to faith, to Jesus Christ through dreams and visions, and just pray that that continues, that people come to their faith and find their final hope and eternal hope in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, the gospel is spreading rapidly in Iran. What could you say in terms of what the U.S. could do to be helpful at this point to maybe make this a tipping point?
Well, first of all, I guess get out of that nuclear deal that we've been discussing, that would fund and just bolster economically the Islamic regime. The other thing, not only come out for the protesters, but against the regime, if they could do that and they could change their policy. These two U.S. senators, Menendez and Rounds, maybe that's a beginning. Maybe that's a tipping point in the change of foreign policy, that they would advocate for regime change inside Iran. And I would also say, Tony, speak directly to the people on the streets. They need the support of other nations, and especially the United States, during the time when, the regime is tottering to a certain point, and whether they could help be a tipping point, to change this regime that's been in power ever since 1979 and spreading its ideology all the way throughout this region and around the world.
Well, we certainly want to encourage our folks to be praying and to speak to their elected officials and to send encouragement to those in Iran, those that are standing up for freedom, and as you said, putting their lives on the line to do so. Yeah. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but we have actually a lot of viewers in Iran. This program is heard and seen in Iran, so we want those folks to know we are praying for them. Before we run out of time, Chris Mitchell, we talked about elections here. We're encouraging people to pray for the elections here, but Israel has elections coming up almost at the same time, November 1st. Is there not an election there in Israel?
Yeah, there's a big election, Tony. It's the fifth one in 3.5 years. And right now, it seems like the Israeli electorate are very divided, just like the United States in many ways. And the recent polls show that the Likud party, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, might be able, by the narrowest of margins, be able to put together a coalition of 61 seats that would be a majority in the Israeli Knesset of 120 seats. Right now, the election is that narrow as it is right there, and we'll see what happens. Just a few votes either way for any one of the literally 30 plus parties here would make a difference and could tip the balance one way or another. But certainly a time to be praying for this election too, to see which direction the Jewish state will be going come after November 1st.
I mean, the challenge with such a narrow margin of a governing coalition is that, you know, one or two people change their mind, and there goes your government.
It's exactly what happened with the former government led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. A couple of those members decided to defect. They had a narrow majority of 61, and it went down to 59. So then the government collapsed. So it's difficult to say. You know, one of the main factors right now is Bibi Netanyahu. A number of people are against him, even though they are ideologically aligned with the Likud party, but they don't want Benjamin Netanyahu. That's one of the biggest factors why there's been so many elections for the past 3.5 years. We'll see if that changes in this election, but it's still very, very narrow margin to see what's going to happen in November 1st.
But I would imagine, given the volatility of the world, even more so than it was a year ago, we see what's happened in Ukraine, we see what's happening in Iran, that Israelis, I would think, want a strong hand at the wheel going forward for the Israeli nation.
That's what a lot of people think. I mean, certainly the people that are supporting Benjamin Netanyahu and Likud, they see him as the kind of leader they want to take into this precarious Middle Eastern world. In fact, right now, polls have shown consistently throughout this time of political volatility that they still do favor Benjamin Netanyahu, as they want him as the prime minister. But because of the political dynamics, it makes it very hard to get that 61-seat majority. But many people say he would be the hand on the wheel to guide the Jewish state through some of these turbulent geopolitical waters, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas, or U.S.-Israel relations. Many people would prefer him right now.
I tell you, love him or not, an amazing leader that's been able to lead Israel through an awful lot over the years.
Yeah,
Chris
that's
Mitchell,
true,
I want
Tony.
to thank you. I want to thank you for staying up late. I know it's I think after midnight there in Jerusalem, and I want to thank you for sticking around. It's always great to hear from you. You mentioned praying for the elections. Obviously, you know, as believers here in this country, we're very concerned and interested in what happens in Israel. Beyond the elections, what else should we be praying for?
Well, pray for the people right now. You know, they're just celebrating Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. So I should say Shana Tova, which means Happy New Year, and have a sweet and prosperous New Year. They're going through a time of introspection. They call this the 10 days of awe, you know, going from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, which will be next week, the Day of Atonement. And I think pray for the Jewish people for, you know, their spiritual renewal during this time. As they actually ask forgiveness, they look for forgiveness during this time to make amends, right? And it's a very deeply spiritual time here in the land during this time. And then followed that by the Feast of Tabernacles later in the month of October. And it's a very special time here spiritually.
All right. Well, Chris Mitchell, I look forward to maybe seeing you in Israel sometime in the near future.
We'll look forward to that, Tony.